Dear God, creator of all, we thank you for the opportunity for fellowship. We thank you for the gift of technology. We thank you for the expertise of our friends and colleagues who are so willing to share it. We thank you for the opportunity to appreciate their gifts and to inquire further about what this means for our faith. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Our guest this morning, our guest speaker is Scott Butcher, old friend of mine. We shared a lot of professional experiences as Foreign Service officers, and Scott's a longtime member of Bradley Hills. And we will be talking about, Scott will be talking about diplomacy and where we might find some sources of hope based on his experiences in the Foreign Service. So I'm going to mute everybody. Scott will, no, Scott won't have to unmute himself, but somebody will have to go unmute the main computer in this room. And then it'll be in the bottom left corner.
There it is.
Got it?
Mhm.
Okay, can you hear me now, everybody? Thumbs up?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, thank you. Scott.
Well, good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and I'm especially appreciative of Steve to think of me because he could be doing this himself. He's had a very distinguished Foreign Service career himself, and I look forward to our being able to swap more of our war stories over coming months and years. Let me just quickly introduce how I'm going to approach this. When I was trying to go through my thoughts, I realized I have stuff that could probably go on for hours, so I have to try and be as concise and distill things into a more measured approach. So what I'm thinking of doing is starting off with the first part would be giving a little of my personal background, some of the places where I've served, then go into and discuss 2 or 3 of the more memorable and consequential experiences I've had in various countries. And then finally to kind of wrap it up with what this all means, lessons learned, looking to the future, and again, the whole issue of how we can bring hope to a very troubled world, and at least as I've had my own experiences, extrapolate from those. And I hope that Steve will join in and critique when necessary and say, that ain't so from my experience. Because what you find is, I think a lot of us, we've had we have some shared experiences and we have very unique ones, depending on the circumstances of where we've served and what the situations are there. So first, let me just quickly tell you how I got into the Foreign Service or interested in the Foreign Service. In high school, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a suburb, and one of my high school teachers in the 11th grade was an American history teacher, and he was a World War I veteran and had been shell-shocked. And he had lots of tremors, but he was a fine historian and inspirational to his students. He set up a chapter of what was called the Junior Council on World Affairs in Cincinnati, attached to the main council, which was supported by the big companies like Procter & Gamble, General Electric, and others. In any case, one of their programs had an American Foreign Service officer come and speak. And he did a very good presentation. I thought, gee, that sounds interesting. Before then, I was thinking of going into medicine. I had a double major in science until I hit chemistry and realized my deficiencies in math wouldn't work. Not to mention having the name of Butcher, which might not attract too many patients. I'd have to go into research. Anyway, I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, majored in government and foreign affairs, and found it very interesting, and had some very good professors. I was surprised a number of them came from some major universities, University of Chicago and others. And again, had some outstanding people who nurtured my interest, shall we say. And I, thinking long and hard, thought the Foreign Service sounded like a very interesting enterprise. And I took the Foreign Service exam in the early part of my senior year, and surprisingly passed. I always thought I was kind of the beneficiary of the Foreign Service's affirmative action program to broaden their geographic recruiting from the East Coast and the Ivy League. And after passing the exam, I finished my senior year and was accepted to a program at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SICE, in Washington, D.C. Carol and I were married shortly after graduation, and we both lived, before we got married, we lived for a while. I had a very short bachelorhood, a few months, never learned to take care of myself. Fortunately, Carol was a film economics major, and turned out to be a wonderful helpmate in our joint career. She had traveled with a university group to South America. I had never left the United States, even Canada, New Mexico, Caribbean islands, anywhere. And people in Cincinnati said, "Why in the world would you leave Cincinnati?" Anyway, so I had a leave without pay from the Foreign Service while I completed my master's degree in international relations at SICE, focusing on Asian politics and history and so on, and ended up going into the Foreign Service in June of 1966. Large class, they were so large they had to divide it in half. One of the reasons was a lot of the people were going to Vietnam to join various programs, not only the U.S. missions, but also what they called CORDS, which was working with our in insecure areas in countryside and so on, with Agency for International Development. And one of my colleagues, a Foreign Service officer, he carried an M16 with him. It's not something you would normally expect entering the Foreign Service. So after my basic training, give you training in a whole range of fields, very short, compressed, including having to learn all about U.S. citizenship services and passports, and which was very, very complicated, at least to me. And then we kind of had the big game was what assignments you would get. And you had a chance to put in your preferences, which might or might not be taken into account. I put in Bangkok for mine, and kind of had a near miss. I ended up being assigned to Rangoon, Burma, now Yangon, Myanmar. And it was very interesting with this large class as they gave out the assignments. People would, if someone was assigned to Paris, they'd go boo. If they were assigned to Saigon, they'd say yay. And then when they said butcher assigned to Rangoon, Burma, silence. It just did not compute. Then when I entered the Foreign Service, I had 2 years of college French, 2 years of graduate school French, took the exam, the oral, the French exam, and my French was just not good enough. I could speak about, international law, economics, all kinds of things. I had a great vocabulary, but they gave me a French movie magazine, and my French pop culture was wanting. So instead of giving me 2 weeks of training at the Foreign Service Language Institute, which I probably would have, they'd have blessed me because I'd have now gone through their program. Instead, they assigned me to Burmese language training. So after 6 months of Burmese language training, I ended up getting off language probation in Burmese, which has been mightily useful ever since. I totally forgot. Except there's in our one of the local drugstores, there's a Burmese woman, and I will say something to her in Burmese, and she usually stares at me, then she realizes I'm speaking her language. Talking to her. Anyway, so we went off to Rangoon for a 2-year assignment. Thank goodness I had Burmese because they were very it was a military xenophobic socialist government. They called it the Burmese Road to Socialism, and we called it the Burmese Road to Ruin. It was terribly mismanaged. It was a xenophobic, anti-foreign government. They forced out Indians, Chinese, all the Western doctors and so on. So when we had our first child born, we had to go to Bangkok, Thailand, and camp out for a couple of weeks. And Carol had our first daughter, Laura, at the Bangkok nursing home. Anyway, the assignment was turned out to be very, very interesting and rewarding because I had Burmese language, felt very comfortable moving around the country, visiting places like Mandalay and Bagan and other areas, and actually met with people. It's the only people who really had contact with the government were the ambassador and me. I ended up, after my initial rotation among the various sections of the embassy, ended up being the sole consular officer for the remainder of my tour, which meant that if the government needed visas, they had to deal with me. So at least I had some governmental contact. Anyway, it was a very interesting assignment, although a difficult one. After that, on April 1st, April Fool's Day of 1969, we were due to be reassigned. We didn't know where our goods were going. They were all packed up. My successor had already arrived, and got a message saying that I was assigned to Dhaka, East Pakistan. And I went up to the communications people and I said, okay, this is pretty funny, guys. What's my real assignment? And they said, well, sir, that's it. And Arthur Hummel, later to become our ambassador to Beijing, sent a message to the State Department saying, how can you assign a young officer with a young wife and a newborn child to a place like Dhaka? Because even by then, it was quite clear there was a lot of turmoil in Pakistan. And the Near East Bureau, Near East and South Asia Bureau, wrote back and said it's the best assignment we have for a political officer in that area. Just to step back a bit, the Foreign Service is broken into several main specialties, and there are subspecialties within those. One is political, another is economic. Steve is an economic officer, I believe. Management and consular. And you tend to follow these tracks. The folks who are in economic and political work tend to be, they have language training, they tend to be, often are focused on a certain geographic area. Whereas those in consular and management tend to be a little more worldwide assignable. But again, a lot of it has to do with language and what languages you're trained in. So in my case, I chose political. As you move up the scale, and then people, when they get to senior levels, go into areas called program management, which is a rather amorphous thing. Anyway, I was a political officer, so I was supposedly fortunate to be assigned to Dhaka. After East Pakistan, I'll come back to East Pakistan because that was one of the most consequential of my assignments. After my assignment in Dhaka, I went back to the State Department and actually was initially Pakistan desk officer and then East Pakistan desk officers as that crisis heated up. And then I ended up being the first Bangladesh desk officer. After a couple of years there, I moved up to what they call the front office of the Near East and South Asia Bureau and was an aide to the assistant secretary. After that assignment, which was very intensive, I decided I needed to have a change of pace and decided to go off to a quieter post, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which was one of the fairly successful developing countries, had Malay language training. And we arrived there on August 4th, 1975, which happened to be the day that the Japanese Red Army terrorists took over part of the US Embassy. So much for arriving in quiet KL. I arrived there the next day in a Malaysian police car carrying a case of sea rations. Just another typical foreign service assignment. We were there for 4 years. We had a wonderful experience. Our youngest daughter was born there. They actually had good medical facilities, which was nice for a change. So we had a 4-year assignment in Malaysia. Then I was we returned to the State Department. I was in what was called the State Department Operations Center, which is the crisis watch for the State Department. And I was a senior watch officer for the whole period that of the Iran hostage situation. And I would have been on duty when Ann Swift, who was a senior political officer in Tehran, called back to the operations center and said they're coming over the wall. And I had changed my shift because it was the birthday, the 4th birthday of our youngest daughter, the one who was born in Malaysia. So when I came on duty, everything was people were running around with their hair on fire trying to deal with that crisis. 2 years after the 2 years there, which was exciting to say the least, we took an assignment to Jakarta, Indonesia, where I was the political counselor, the head of the political section. Fascinating assignment. I'll come back to that as another of the consequential ones. And after 3 years there, and by the way, it was you talk about inscrutable Orientals. Indonesia is a sprawling archipelago. People haven't, because the geographers compressed, the map makers compressed the equatorial zones. It appears to be very, tiny little specks on the maps. That is actually a huge country. If you put the easternmost island, Sabang, on Seattle, the westernmost part, Merauke, would stick out to Bermuda. So it just gives you an idea of how broad it is. Anyway, the multiple races and the differing religions. So you have Christianity. The main religion is Islam. It's the most populous Muslim country in the world. But there are also large populations of Christians, animists, and Bali is Hindu. So it's an interesting place. The center is Java, and the Javanese are very non-assertive, shall we say. They will smile, they will nod, they're very much into conflict avoidance, and reporting conversations was always very difficult. The basic functions of political and economic officers are reporting, representation, and negotiation. And one of the things about the reporting, which is a contrast to what we see in a lot of our media these days, is that we have to play it straight. We report the facts as we see them, and then when we do the analysis, it comes in commentary. It comes in a separate line. So you have a very factual rendition, and then you have the comments very clearly made. Now it seems that everywhere we go, the commentary dominates, and you have to sort through what's fact and what's someone's personal views and perceptions, which is obviously getting even more difficult as we get into things like AI, which will now be creating things. Just tell it what you want and it'll come up with it for you. After Indonesia, went back to Washington and served for 3 years in our Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, following Asia and Indian Ocean affairs. It was in the office of what they call international security policy. And I was one of the 2 deputy directors. So I had a very interesting part of the world. Philippines dominated. The Philippines was, we had very important strategic issues with the bases. And I was involved in some of the base reviews that they had. But Marcos was running the country into the ground. The New People's Army, communist insurgency was making headway. And in fact, it was so bad that people would say, how can you tell a communist insurgent and then New People's Army insurgent from the armed forces of the Philippines soldiers? And the answer was the insurgents have uniforms, because there was so much corruption that the common soldiers weren't getting their pay. It was being ripped off by the time it got down to them. I visited a couple of military camps at the time, and they looked like farms because they had to have subsistence to feed their families. It was pretty bad stuff. And then I visited one place that was very depressed in Mindanao in southern Philippines, and there was communist graffiti all over. The markets were empty, and I visited one military camp that was full of shot up military vehicles. And it was attributed to just the whole depressed state of affairs under Marcos. Watched him being deposed with the People's Power Revolution in 1986. Was in the Operations Center of the State Department, and Philip Habib, who was then a senior official at the State Department, was watching the split screen CNN. One screen showed Marcos and his family sitting in the presidential palace, Malacanang, on this very gilded sofa. And he's saying that he's tired of what's happening. There was protests going on, and he was now ordering the Philippine Marines to put down these illegal protests. The other screen showed tanks on EDSA Boulevard with crowds of people riding on them, flowers out of the gun barrels. And Ambassador Philip Habib said at that point, a booming voice, he's lost it. And someone nudged me and said, they can hear him in Manila. Anyway, a year later, I went out, kind of retraced my steps from a previous visit, and went down to Davao del Sur, and the place was booming. The graffiti was whitewashed over. The markets were full, and it was all attributed to the ending of the coconut monopoly that some of Marcos's cronies were running, and that was all ended. And the smallholders growing coconut and other crops were being able to get the money for their labors. It was a dramatic occurrence. I'm currently dealing with the Philippine military on some exercises, and they're now totally professionalized. They're working under a democratic government, so things have really changed. After that assignment, I spent a year as deputy director of Philippine Affairs. After 1 year, was promoted, and then was able to be the director of India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka affairs in the Near East South Asia Bureau, which was a fascinating assignment. And following that, went back to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, as deputy chief of mission, which is kind of the deputy ambassador. Now back to the important, the most consequential of my assignments was to East Pakistan, as it was in the process of becoming Bangladesh. But how this all happened is goes back a few years. General Ayub Khan had been the military dictator who ran the country, and with not a terribly hard touch, but it was still a non-participatory government, shall we say. They had open markets, which made quite a contrast, even in impoverished East Pakistan. Things were available that were not available in a socialist economy next door in what should have been wealthy Burma. But in early 1969, major protests broke out, and Ayub Khan was forced out of office and replaced by a fellow General Yahya Khan. And Yahya, again, a strong man, but decided it was because of all the pressures and the previous protests that forced his predecessor out, that it was important to open up the political system again. Political parties were once again legalized, and he set in motion a process for national elections for both provincial and central government office. The National Assembly was their national parliament. And so when I arrived, electioneering was underway, and it was a very lively place. And unlike the xenophobic Burmese, the folks, the majority in East Pakistan were ethnic Bengalis. During partition and the division of India into what turned out to be three parts. Pakistan had two parts. It had a west wing, which was centered on the Punjab and 4 provinces. And then the east was the majority Muslim area of East Bengal. And that became East Pakistan, the province. And in any case, just to run through very quickly, politics was in full force. Elections were scheduled for, I believe it was sometime in late November. And then a huge cyclone, one of the worst natural disasters in recent history, killed hundreds of thousands of people in southern East Pakistan. It was harvest season. Many people, migrant workers, had come in to harvest the rice. Very low-lying area. Storm came up the Bay of Bengal, coincided with a high tide, and they had a tidal surge of up to 30 feet. Wow. And the initial reports when they hit Dhaka were that thousands had been killed. Well, there's always a certain amount of exaggeration. You hear this all the time in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. But when the pictures started coming in showing bodies high in trees and cattle and other livestock, all over, it was a horrendous, horrific disaster. And the U.S. and others globally came to respond to the disaster, and sent in many aircraft, transport aircraft. And the U.S. was one of the leaders. We brought in C-141s with helicopters from an air base near Tampa, and they flew in crews from Vietnam. And we had the first Boeing 747 I had ever seen was at the airport that had brought in relief goods. Pan Am flew in a number of flights on 707s. And here's a photo of unloading some of the relief goods from little kids. And these, it's hard, hardest to read, but it says survival supplies furnished by Office of Civil Defense, Department of Defense, survival ration biscuit. So they were bringing those in. And I was able to fly down on one of the relief helicopters down to the area. And this is the helicopter. That's my Pan Am bag on the ground. A well-traveled Pan Am bag. And another flight, relief flight. Helicopters, unloadings, survival. And then finally, this is the, at the end of the relief operation, this is our consul general, his wife.
Yeah.
There we go.
His wife, Meg, our consul general is Arthur K. Blood. His wife's Margaret, known as Meg. And this is a Air Force colonel, I believe, from the embassy in Islamabad. More about Archblood in a moment. In any case, the relief mission was quite well done. Many countries were involved. The Soviet Union, Canada flew in relief supplies, and regrettably, a Canadian plane crashed on its way on its departure, as did a Russian aircraft, a Soviet aircraft. In any case, after the relief operation, the question was, would they postpone elections further? And it was decided that they would hold the elections in December in all areas, except for the directly affected by the cyclone, known as the Bola cyclone. Elections were held, and in a tremendously exciting and for many of the West Pakistanis shocking development, the East Pakistan political party, the Awami League, headed by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, very charismatic political figure, very controversial because he preached autonomy for East Pakistan. The East Pakistanis, we had a very improbable situation with a divided country, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, culturally very different and separated by an often hostile India. And the divisions were very strong. And there were a multiplicity of parties. The Muslim League, based in West Pakistan, had strong influence in the East too. And over the years, the West Pakistani elite was able to basically control things because the politics of the East was divided. However, the growing resentment over the years of being treated as kind of second-class citizens, kind of the little brown brothers, because they were, by complexion, the Bengalis were darker than the West Pakistanis and shorter in stature. The West Pakistanis were more coming from a more austere environment, had the militant background. A lot of the West Punjabis and so on had provided the basis of the Indian forces under the British rule and continued these martial traditions, whereas the Easterners were much more artistic. They had a rich culture. They were very close to the West Bengalis culturally and shared a lot of the cultural heroes. So Rabindranath Tagore, who had won a Nobel Prize for literature, was one of their heroes. And in fact, one of his poems called Amar Shonar Bangla, My Golden Bengal, is part of the maybe, I'm not sure it's the national anthem of Bangladesh, but it's certainly very popular. In any case, the election ended up being won. The East Pakistanis won all but 2 of the National Assembly seats coming from East Pakistan. And because it was a one-man, one-vote situation and the East had a greater population, it meant that the majority party was going to be the Awami League in the National Assembly. The East Pakistanis were overjoyed. They were looking forward to having their place in the nation and possibly reordering some of the The things like money, the amount of funding of the military. Things like Kashmir were not their East Pakistanis issues. They had issues with India, but they were over water division and things like that. In any case, as negotiations were underway to form the National Assembly, suddenly, I believe it was on March 2nd of 1971, there was an announcement that the seating of the National Assembly was postponed indefinitely, which the East Pakistanis saw as annulling the election. Civil unrest took place for several weeks. The military in that period, I thought, was very restrained. They were being spat upon by the locals, who were very incensed that their election was being taken away from them, their election victory. And on the night of March 25th, 26th, 1971, things started to go terribly haywire. I got a call from Sidney Schanberg, who I had met previously. He was a New York Times journalist who had been out covering the situation. And he said that he and his colleagues who were in the Intercontinental Hotel were being held at gunpoint by the military. He dictated a telegram. He hoped that we could get out through embassy channels. I still have the notes, and I talked to him, years later, and we shared some of our stories. He's famous for being the author of The Killing Fields, about the genocide in Cambodia. In any case, it was things were clearly turning bad, and I reported the conversation to my boss, who was at a reception at the Consul General Archblood's house, and he said, my boss, the senior political officer, said that they had a man who had been stabbed brought into their compound, and things were very troubled. We heard sounds. We were at a strategic bridge and happened to live about 6 doors down from Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and we heard sounds, and it was locals and police building barricades to try and keep the military from attacking Sheikh Mujib. Anyway, Carol and I decided that it was, what do you do when you're waiting for a war to break out? The long and short of it was you go to bed because you need to get some sleep. And about 1:26 the next morning, March 26th, heavy weaponry being fired right outside the bedroom. And we had a very slight setback from the road. And it was quite an experience. I ended up being injured by had rug burns on both my knees from hitting the carpet. Carol's sitting up saying, "Scott, what's happening?" I told her to join me. We went into an inner bedroom. Next morning, there was shooting all night. We could see fires in the distance. The sun came up. I tried to get out, and there was an armed soldier outside our gate. As soon as I opened the gate, he leveled his weapon at me. Well, clearly he didn't speak English, and I don't speak Urdu, but I got the message, went back in. After 36 hours, the curfew was ended. A number of us were assembled back at the Consulate General. We compared notes. People talked about the killings that had happened. Large numbers of people had been killed, students and faculty at the University of Dhaka. Journalists had been killed. The pro-Awami League newspaper publishing area had been blown up. We could hear rhythmic shooting as they were executing captured police and East Pakistani paramilitary. You can see fires in the distance. Driving into the office bodies on the street. It was terrible, and it was a horrific situation because East Pakistan was basically a humanitarian interest to the United States. West Pakistan had some base facilities that we had used for U-2 flights over the Soviet Union and so on. But the East was a huge development project. We had the Ceto Kara lab there. We had lots of aid workers, lots of NGOs, and there was marvelous work going on to help the development of the East. So there was no strategic reason that we could see why the U.S. could not help out. Instead, whereas other countries were condemning the widespread violence, especially against Hindus, some well-known Hindu faculty members were killed just because they were Hindu. It clearly was looming as at least a selective genocide, as our boss Archer Blood noted in his cables. But we had essentially silence from Washington, whereas other countries were condemning the violence, calling for an end of it. Washington basically was saying, we hope that all parties will eschew violence. Well, the violence was directed only in one direction. It was coming from a well-armed, well-trained military against the local populace. And after our families were evacuated, non-essential personnel were evacuated, but the evacuation by the U.S. was not by U.S. military or chartered aircraft. We had to fly our folks out on Pakistan International Airlines, PIA. And when I went out to see Carol and some of our friends off, Carol and our daughter Laura, you could see the Pakistani military-age men in white Punjabi attire marching off the same plane our people were going to fly out on. So basically, we were subsidizing the half of the trip of the Pakistan military coming in. So in early April, a number of us got together, especially some of the younger members of the consulate, and said we need to do something about that. And I took some notes and drafted a telegram signed by some 20 or so of my colleagues and myself, and took it into Consul General Blood and gave it to his secretary, and with some trepidation, because the only way to get it out is through official channels, and his secretary came back to my office, which was a couple doors away, and said, "We need another. Do you have another page, second page for this telegram, which had a green cover and then carbons underneath?" And it turns out, I thought, oh my goodness, now what? It turns out he added his own comment, which in essence endorsed what we were saying about our government. That it's a fairly strong message. It is declassified officially now. I used to have my own copy, which was classified. I pouched it to myself. And unfortunately, when I got to the State Department, I got a cleaner copy. Unfortunately, there was a garble, so there's a whole missing section from what I had drafted, and I have no idea what it was. It kind of doesn't make sense now. That just said, aware of task force proposals on openness in the Foreign Service, and with the conviction that U.S. policy related to recent developments in East Pakistan serves neither our moral interests broadly defined, nor our national interests narrowly defined. Numerous officers of Amcon Gen Dhaka, USAID Dhaka, and USIS Dhaka consider it their duty to register strong dissent with fundamental aspects of this policy. Our government has failed to denounce the suppression of democracy. Our government has failed to denounce atrocities. Our government has failed to take forceful measures to protect its citizens, while at the same time bending over backwards to placate the West Pakistan dominated government and to lessen likely and deservedly negative international public relations impact against it, and so on. It did not go over well in Washington, and to the extent that
What was the year?
Pardon me?
What was the year again?
1971.
Okay.
And I have a copy of a memorandum of conversation that Henry Kissinger, our ambassador to Pakistan, and a note taker had. And Kissinger was quoted as saying, "Another problem is the quality of political reporting in Dhaka. The reporters there are missionaries without significant practical experience. They have never before seen war and are grossly exaggerating the amount of killing and bloodshed there." So that's from Kissinger. So, and there were stronger things. What I would recommend, it's a very fascinating and dispiriting time in American policy.
Yeah.
There are two very good books. One is by Arch Blood. This became known as the Blood Telegram because it was his name that was on it. When it reaches Washington, it doesn't have drafting information or anything like that. So it was his, and he was excoriated. He was a high riser in the Foreign Service, and he sacrificed his career to do the right thing. And he wrote his memoirs of that period called The Cruel Birth of Bangladesh, Memoirs of an American Diplomat. And then more recently, in 2014, Professor Gary Bass, a former New York Times correspondent, who's now a professor at Princeton, wrote a book called The Blood Telegram. And I believe it's something like Kissinger, Nixon, and a little known genocide or something to that effect. In any case, I went back to Washington, was Pakistan desk officer, was able to follow through on a number of things. Although one of the things that was problematic was the wives who were evacuated were extraordinarily upset with our policy. They drafted a kind of a form letter that could then be adapted to people to send to their various congressmen. And Carol's father worked at Ford, was able to have access to copying machines, and lots of copies were made. I have a sample here. Someone wrote to the Honorable Harry Byrd, dear Senator Byrd, from Elizabeth Lee, a resident of Virginia, a constituent complaining about our policy. Well, this was printed, as I said, by Carol's father, or copied. And so I'm the Pakistan desk officer. The irate congressman writes to the State Department, and it comes to the Pakistan desk officer to reply. So Carol kept me busy.
Let me jump in here because we only have a few minutes left. First, with a comment about the omniscient wisdom of the State Department in a major humanitarian situation, assigning officers named Butcher and Blood. But the culture of the Foreign Service that Scott mentioned here, with the consulate staff in Dhaka feeling free to write a cable that dissented from U.S. government policy. This was before we had formalized this process in the State Department. But there is now what's called the dissent channel, and every employee has the absolute right to send a message dissenting from U.S. government policy, and it goes directly to the Secretary of State. State and USAID, I believe, are the only two agencies in the United States government that have formalized the right of employees to challenge what policy is. And it's extremely valuable in the context of the State Department. You see it in a situation here. Scott didn't get to the point of why Kissinger reacted so badly, but it was because Kissinger was using the Pakistanis as the channel to communicate with China at the beginning of the opening to China. So that was close held to about 4 people in the world. So that
The ambassador in Pakistan didn't even know. He was briefed afterwards.
so this is why Kissinger didn't like the idea that we should be undermining, we should have policy undermining the government of Pakistan. But that policy is one of the reasons that we should have some hope about international affairs. is that there is the opportunity to dissent, and sometimes this dissent works. We have changed Sudan policy. We changed policy in the Balkans because officers were consistently going past their ambassadors to recommend other policy. It happened in Vietnam. We didn't have this formalized, and the form that it took there was resignations, and there were a lot of resignations during the Vietnam War over that policy. But let me ask Scott, in current issues, we're seeing rising tensions with China. We're seeing massive conflict in Eastern Europe with Ukraine. Do you see the opportunity or the causes for hope in resolving these tensions through diplomacy?
Because of time restraints, I couldn't really get into some of the other things that I wanted to say, but the answer is yes, we have to keep plugging away. There's some, I was going to talk a bit about Indonesia, where the fact that the Indonesians felt that we had a strategic relationship back in the Cold War era during the 80s and so on, when I was there, enabled us to do things that were very intrusive on the human rights, labor rights front and things like that. And sometimes we have to balance these things in ways, but the problem with Kissinger on the Bangladesh issue was that he didn't see that some of these things were not mutually exclusive. You can press on human rights are important because they have, you can deal easily with a dictator. Things can be done one man, no checks and balances on him. We need, one of the other things that we have to continue doing. We often will manage problems, keep them from escalating. And I think this is where the hope is really important. If we are pessimistic and kind of give up, we will, our interests, which include the humanitarian ones, will fail. We have a problem of the unintended consequences of good intentions, that we have people who I know and respect, but who are ultimately naive about our ability to push our values on other cultures and countries. We as Americans tend to, we're pretty good people basically, and we tend to think others are like that. There is evil in the world. There are some cultures that are extraordinarily backward that we have to take into account. We need to often work around the edges, look for incremental positive movement rather than just instant gratification. One of the things that I think is very important, and it helps us ultimately, is this. And the caption is 90,000 tons of diplomacy. It shows a Nimitz class carrier, plowing through the sea. Strength is important without being provocative, but being strong and having the will to press our case to support groups, support countries that are being aggressed upon, like Ukraine, which is a terrible situation. And I think that, and again, with China, I think China's watching what happens with the free world and how they support Ukraine. And they're going to, take into account what the costs are if they continue bullying their neighbors and do something precipitous and using force against to bring Taiwan into their orbit.
No other nation in the world puts human rights quite as much front and center in their foreign policy as we do. To a certain extent, that's driven by congressional mandates. To a certain extent, that's driven by non-governmental organizations having a pretty powerful voice in the US. To a certain extent, it's a function of who we are. Is that overall a useful focus for our foreign policy, do you think?
Yes. And we have the phenomenon now of Putin's military targeting civilians. It's not that they're collateral damage. They're being targeted. Their infrastructure is being targeted. They're being made this summer. On August 25th, 2022, the Secretary of Defense promulgated an edict, memorandum for senior Pentagon leadership, commanders of the combatant commands, the agency and DoD field activity directors, civilian harm mitigation and response action plan. We already have lawyers, military lawyers, talking about use of force, rules of engagement, and all kinds of other things to avoid civilian casualties. This is now being reinforced by a major promulgation by the Secretary of Defense. We try to protect civilians. Doesn't mean they're not going to be harmed, but we try to mitigate that to the extent possible. That's who we are. So the answer is yes.
I'm going to unpin Scott here so that I can see if anybody else has got a hand raised. Joni, turn your mic on and ask your question.
This isn't a question, it's a statement. Having known this family for such a long time, I hope one of the takeaways from this presentation is what the Foreign Service families give up in the way of service to our country. There's a lot of attention paid to the military, but not so much paid to the Foreign Service, and they deserve equal credit.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Evelyn, you got an electronic hand raised there. You got to unmute yourself, Evelyn.
Okay, first, let me just say thank you for the presentation. I immediately felt a connection since I'm a graduate of SAIS as well and experienced a coup in Ethiopia, the overthrow of Haile Selassie in 75-76. So I felt connection. I have a question. The recent series of global crises, including the Russian invasion of Ukraine and conflicts in Ethiopia, Syria, Yemen, and Myanmar, which is formerly Burma, who experienced their coup in 2021, I believe. All of this appear to indicate the emergence of a new status quo defined by radical volatility and uncertainty. And my question is, do you think that authoritarian countries and alternative government systems have outperformed democratic countries? Do you think that authoritarian countries and alternative government systems have outperformed democratic countries in recent years?
Maybe in the short term, but not in the long term. They can use power. I mean, it's like the Burmese people would ask me when I was doing some business consulting about investing in Burma. I said, no way, there's no rule of law. Power grows out of the barrel of the gun. And that's the problem in many authoritarian regimes. They don't have the will of the people, and the will of the people is strong. And if you have a participatory government, it has a resiliency that these authoritarian regimes don't have. That's my view. Another issue is the question that we have in places like where there's, for want of a better term, still tribalism, where people, we talk about celebrating diversity. Well, perhaps in America we can, but in much of the world, just getting people to tolerate diversity between themselves and whatever the other is defined as. It's, the Cold War provided a certain framework to kind of dampen down some of these issues. So when you had the breakup of places like Yugoslavia, all these old deep divisions arose. I went to a meeting between the then National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, and K.C. Punt, who was the then Defense Minister of India. And National Security Advisor Scowcroft, General Scowcroft, commended India on its multiplicity of ethnicity and religions, and their democracy and so on and so forth. And the defense minister of India said, "Thank you for those kind remarks, General Scowcroft. But the problem is that you may have divisions and you're able to reconcile. Our problem is our divisions run very deep." And this is what we sometimes fail to realize in some of these older countries. I mean, we're still relatively new, that they face, their grievances go back centuries, and they have terrible divisions. And being able to tolerate differences is something that is really important. Interdenominational, ecumenical type things between religions. I have many friends of many religions, and generally those practitioners who followed the basic precepts of moderate precepts of their religions were very good in terms of dealing with others. It's the ones who are the extremists, and that relates to authoritarian regimes too, that tend to be extremists.
This problem is particularly severe across Africa, where the national borders are drawn at the convenience of European colonial powers. And there's absolutely no regard for ethnicity in where the national lines are drawn, with a result that the ethnic groups are forced into different countries. Ethnic groups that don't like each other are forced into the same country. And the problem cannot be solved because the realignment of borders is simply too complex a problem. One of the ideas that I carried with me through my career came from my 7th grade geography teacher. At the time that African countries were gaining their independence, he said that the borders of Africa make so little sense that they must be defended at all costs. And that has held absolutely true. There's been almost no change of borders in Africa, with the exception of the creation of Eritrea. That's about it. We are now 5 minutes long, and I do need to talk just a little bit about adult education next week, which is going to be a very exciting time for us. Our topic will be the renovation of the Scotland AME Zion Church on 7 Locks Road. This is a historic Black church in our area that suffered a devastating flood in July of 2019. The waters came down the hillside behind the church, flooded out the basement, and undermined the foundation of the church to the extent that the building was condemned immediately. The congregation has been meeting at the Bethesda UCC church at the corner of Fernwood and Democracy ever since. They're raising money to renovate it. It's a massive project with a lot of community support behind it. And as we talked to the people who are behind that effort this week, they said, we asked if we should invite the congregation from Bethesda UCC to attend, and they said, let's invite the entire Interfaith Friends of Scotland group. This is 24 congregations. So we will be meeting next Sunday morning live in Covenant Hall. We urge everybody who possibly can to attend live, because we'll have a significant number of guests from other congregations, and we'd like to make them feel welcome. And we will be online as well, and we can accommodate up to 300 people on the Zoom. So it's going to be an exciting time with a much bigger audience than we usually have. And the things that they have planned go way beyond just rebuilding this church. Some really exciting things for our whole community this year and in the years going forward. So I urge everybody to please make a special effort to attend next Sunday for what should be a really exciting and uplifting program on the future of our community. So with that, I will say thank you. Thanks to Scott for a fascinating
Yes.
conversation. You get the sense that Scott barely scratched the surface. If you offer a foreign service officer an adult beverage or two, you'll get hours of talk like this. Even without the adult beverage. And don't get three of us together. We'll never stop talking. So thank you, Scott. Blessings on everybody this week.
Thank you.